All right, well, it looks like a number of you have logged on and ready for today's webinar. Good morning, everyone. Amanda Gerber, Marketing Director with DWD. Thank you so much for your interest in our session today, Board Member Review of Form 990. For those of you that have questions during the presentation today, please submit them using the Q&A feature. We will be answering questions throughout today's presentation as well as at the end. With us presenting today is DWD's Nonprofit Service Team Director, Carrie Minnick. We will also have team members Susan Berghoff and Tyson Moore with us, who will be helping to answer any questions you may have submitted. At this time, I will turn it over to Carrie to get started.
Thanks, Amanda. And again, welcome all of you to today's session. We're going to be going through the IRS Form 990 today, obviously not line by line, but there will be a link in the chat window for you to pull up a copy of that IRS Form 990 if you would like to have it in front of you as well. Or if you have a copy of your organization's own 990 that you'd like to pull up and follow along with, that might be beneficial as well. So oftentimes a nonprofit organization will have an external CPA or an accountant prepare the 990 for them, which is completely fine. However, as a board member, it is really your responsibility to make sure that that 990 is prepared properly and on time. There's actually a question on Form 990 that asks, has the organization provided a complete copy of this Form 990 to all members of its governing body before filing the form? This means that an exact copy of what is filed with the IRS needs to be provided to all of your board members prior to filing the 990 in order for this question to be answered yes. This is not actually a law or necessarily an IRS requirement that this is done. However, it is best practices, and you really want to try and answer as many of these questions yes as you can on the 990. In addition to the IRS coming out and asking you if your board reviews the 990 prior to filing, it's really also part of your 10 basic responsibilities as a board member. One of those is to protect the assets and provide financial oversight of the organization. And this really means reviewing the annual Form 990 to make sure that it is complete, accurate, and filed on time. So as you go through and look at the 990, you want to, again, make sure, is it accurate? This is a public document, so you want to make sure that all of the questions are accurately answered, making sure all that the questions are answered, because the IRS actually considers a return where not all of the questions have been answered as incomplete and therefore not filed on time. So you want to make sure all the questions are answered. And then also, as you look at the questions, make sure that you are meeting any legal requirements that your organization may have. And then finally, any no answers may raise flags with the IRS, and we'll kind of talk about that as we go through. So yes, your 990 is a form that's filed with the IRS and it's required to be filed. However, you should really look at it as a marketing tool as well. Again, it is a public document, but if you, so you want to use it as the best that you can. Some members of the public, this is all they're going to see of your organization is your 990. So you really want to make sure that everything is portrayed correctly, accurately on the form. So who is looking at your 990? Donors, grantors, potential board members, external evaluators. So you have a lot of different people looking at your 990. So you want to make sure that what you're portraying gives off an accurate picture of your organization. The readers are using your Form 990 to make decisions that really affect your organization's ability to obtain funding. Can you provide services accurately? Are you maintaining proper governance? And are you achieving the goals for which it exists? Also, when you are preparing your 990, make sure that your terminology and your words that you use are clear. Nonprofits tend to use a lot of jargon that may be unique to the sector or that particular field of work. So the people that are reading your 990 may not understand certain terms like mission-driven, capacity, or development. So you want to make sure that you use terms that a normal layperson is able to understand, so make sure that your messages are clear. Really what you're doing is telling your organization's story through the 990, through both financial and non-financial. So the IRS, just a little bit background on the 990, the IRS redesigned Form 990 in 2008. It was a very big change that was done that year. They decided that it needed to be redone to enhance transparency. Nonprofits really have a premier tax status, so they really have an additional responsibility on transparency to promote compliance. And then the IRS also thought that this redesign would minimize the burden of filing organizations. Now, most people would probably not agree with that statement. However, that was one of the intentions of the redesign. Most nonprofit organizations are required to file a Form 990. There are some exceptions to this. Churches, religious organizations are not required to file a Form 990. There are 3 different 990s that your organization may have to file depending on your gross revenue and your assets. So if you're a smaller organization, you're just going to file a postcard, the 990N. A little bit larger organizations are going to file the 990EZ. And then those organizations that have gross receipts of $200,000 or more, or total assets of $500,000 or more, are required to file Form 990. So the first thing that you should look at when you're reviewing your 990 is making sure that you are filing the correct form for your organization. Now, if your organization is a private foundation, you would file the 990 PF. And then if you have any unrelated business income of $1,000 or more, you would have to file an additional return called a Form 990T. There are some exceptions of where certain nonprofits have to file a Form 990, even if they have less than $50,000 of gross receipts. So there are some exceptions, but those are pretty rare. So these are pretty much the standards here as far as what level of 990 your organization should follow. If your organization does have less than $200,000 of gross receipts, it may choose to file a Form 990 as opposed to a 990EZ if it would like. I know some organizations do this just because the Form 90 provides additional information about the organization. And when that organization provides that to donors, funders, foundations, they like to see that type of thing. So if your organization can file the 990N or 990EZ, you can choose to file a 990 if you'd like, but you don't have to. So Form 990 starts with a core form. It has 12 pages. And then depending on your organization's activities and what type of organization you have, there are 16 additional schedules that may need to be completed. Now, it is very rare that any organization would have to file all 16 supporting schedules. Usually organizations will have to file an additional 3 or 4 schedules. And we are not going to go over every single one of these schedules today, but we will talk about a couple of very common ones that most nonprofits do have to file. When looking at the core form, so this initial 12-page document that all organizations have to file, it is divided into different sections, and you can see on the screen here the different sections. So we are going to briefly touch on some of these sections today, and other sections we're going to dig in a little bit deeper because just as a board member, you want to make sure that these are properly reflective of what your organization is doing. And then we have, again, the 16 additional schedules based on what your type of organization and what your organization does. Most organizations will have to file Schedule A, which is the public charity status and public support test, and we'll look into that a little bit. And then Schedule B, your schedule of contributors, so who's giving to your organization, is another schedule that most organizations will have to complete. And then also Schedule O, the supplemental information to Form 990, is a schedule that most organizations have to complete. So in addition to going over the core form today, we're going to touch briefly on those 3 schedules as well. If your organization does have other activities, if you have any lobbying activities, or if you're a school, you'll just want to make sure that you're properly filing those additional schedules that are required. All right, so this is the first page of the 2020 Form 990. And again, we are not going to go line by line, but there are just a few things on each section that I really want to point out that you make sure that you look at when you're reviewing your organization's 990. So the first part here is the organization's header, very basic information about the organization. However, there's a section over here at section B that talks about different things that may have happened during the year with your organization. For example, if your organization's name changes or if you have an address change, you want to make sure that that box is checked appropriately so that way the IRS can update their records. Also, if this is the first year of your organization and this is your initial return, you're going to want to check that box. Or if your organization is terminating, going out of business, you're also going to want to make sure that you check that box, because then that will notify the IRS that this is the last return that they can expect from you. And then they won't start giving you late notices for not filing returns after this return. Another item to make sure that is reported properly is your organization's website. So if your organization has a website, you want to make sure that you correctly list that here. The IRS will look at your organization's website and compare what is recorded on your 990. So you want to make sure that those two are comparable so that you don't have something listed on your website that you're not reporting on your 990. This next section here is a summary of information that is provided in other pages of the Form 990. The very first question, where it asks to briefly describe the organization's mission and most significant activities, we're going to talk about that in a little bit later in more depth. But this is really the first thing that the reader is going to see about your organization. So you want to make sure that that is completed properly and really catches their attention to what your organization is doing. Also in this section that I see sometimes gets overlooked is on line 6, the total number of volunteers. Now this can be an estimate. You don't need to have an exact number, but really if your organization has volunteers, which it probably does, you want to make sure that you put something in there. Your board members are volunteers, most likely if they're not paid. So you want to include them. And answering this question with a number really shows that your organization is getting support from the community through volunteers. So it's important to answer that question. And then this section here is just a comparable year over year of your income and expenses. The next section in part 2 is the signature block. You want to make sure that your 990 is signed by the proper person. It must be signed by the current president, vice president, treasurer, assistant treasurer, some officer of the organization who is authorized to sign as of the date the return is filed. So this individual that is signing this return may not have been an officer during the year that the return is covering. But it is important that they are currently an officer. So usually that's the executive director, the CEO, or a board officer, the board chair, treasurer, someone like that. All right, the next section, part 3, talks about the statement of program service accomplishments. So this is where, again, not numbers, but words, we're going to talk about what the organization is doing. So the first section here first question, number 1, asks you to briefly describe the organization's mission. So again, on the first page, it asked for a mission or significant activities. Here it is actually asking for your mission as adopted by the governing body. So this is the mission that has been approved by the board. One thing with this, you want to make sure that you review your mission as a board every so often to make sure that that mission is still adequate. Sometimes organizations will have mission drift where they will kind of drift away from what their initial mission of the organization was. So you want to make sure that that is reviewed every so often to make sure that that is still what your organization is doing. And it may need to be tweaked every so often, and that's okay. And if that does need to be changed, we need to notify the IRS of that. And so that's in this, the next question talks about undertaking any significant programs during the year which were not listed on prior Form 990. So that kind of goes along with that. So maybe your mission has changed a bit and you've added programs or you've changed your programs. If you've done that, you need to make sure that you notify the IRS of these changes, because the Form 990 is where you're reporting these changes to the IRS as your organization grows and changes. Initially, your organization it received its tax exempt status from the IRS for what it put on its tax exempt application. So the IRS said, yes, we are approving you as a nonprofit because of what you put on this application. However, over the years, what you're doing may need to be changed, which is fine, but we need to make sure we report that to the IRS so that you're still considered a tax exempt organization in their eyes. So if you report this on there properly and the IRS accepts your 990, they're essentially accepting those changes. So again, we just want to make sure that we are reporting any significant changes to the IRS. Question 4 is a section where I think a lot of nonprofits underutilize these questions. Here, the IRS wants to know what your main program service accomplishments are for its 3 largest programs. And this is based on expenses. So you're going to take your 3 largest programs that have the largest expenses, and you're going to talk about them here. This is really your opportunity to brag on what you accomplished during the year. This is really where you want to get your marketing team involved, development team, to make sure that you are telling the reader what you did during the year. How are you fulfilling your mission? Sometimes I will see this question here, it's just answered as just a repeat of the mission. That's not what they want to know. They've already asked what your mission is. Here they want to know, what are your program service accomplishments? Be as descriptive as possible. Don't feel that you need to be limited to the lines here. It can go over. There's an additional, that's what Schedule O is for overflow. So you don't need to limit yourself just to these lines here. So be as descriptive as possible. Show impact versus results. Use numbers. How many students did you serve? You know, how many volunteer hours? Just be as descriptive and really show off what the organization is doing. And I think this next page here is we're going to go over some examples of what you can use in this section. So these examples here we're going to go over kind of tie together. So on page 1, the IRS asks to describe the organization's mission or most significant activity. So again, this is the first time that really the reader is going to find out about your organization. And we have 3 different nonprofits here with 3 different answers. So nonprofit A's answer to this question, briefly describe the organization's mission or most significant activities, is see Schedule O. Okay, well, that's fine. We can go to Schedule O and read what that says, but really it's not very effective because it's missing an opportunity to provide the mission at the top of the form. No information really is provided here that's encouraging you to go and look on Schedule O. Nonprofit B's answer to this question is financial support for cancer patients. Okay, that's good. That's an effective answer. It states what the organization is doing and for whom. And then nonprofit C's answer is care for homelessness and those at risk of becoming homeless. So again, this is a pretty effective answer to this question because again, it's stating what the organization does and who it's serving. Then in part 3 of the 990, it's asking for the statement under the statement of program service accomplishments, it asks to describe the organization's mission. So again, this is the mission that has been approved by the board. So again, we have the 3 nonprofits. Again, nonprofit A's answer is C part 1. Okay, well, that's really not giving us any new information because in part 1, if you remember, they just said see Schedule O. So again, not very effective. Nonprofit B's answer to this question is financial support for cancer patients, which is okay. It's telling us what their mission is, but it really misses an opportunity to provide any additional information. Now, nonprofit C, when they first asked about the mission and the significant activities, it gave the answer of the care for homelessness and those at risk of being homeless. But now its true mission, goes into a little bit more detail. So yes, it talks about the homeless and the risk, but then it goes into volunteers, the support from the private donations, the number of in-kind services, and it does run over to Schedule O, but it started some information here on Part 3 that makes you want to go read what the rest of it is on Schedule O. So it has a much more effective answer because it not only states the mission, but it also provides additional information about how the organization fulfills its mission, and then expands on that on Schedule O. And then the third question that the IRS asks, kind of related to this program's mission, is the actual program service accomplishments. So again, nonprofit A answered this question by provides funding for basic needs of our clients and training for volunteers. Which again, okay, that's fine, but it's really not very effective. It doesn't describe the program or provide any quantitative or qualitative information about the effectiveness. Nonprofit B's answer was worked with over 90 participating community charities. So it gave how many it worked with, who it worked with, it provided funds through a matching program. So it's a little bit more effective. I would say it's probably adequate because it briefly describes the program and how it works. It does provide some quantitative information indicating the magnitude of the program. But then again, we have nonprofit C, who probably gave the best answer because they're talking about providing meals to 50 partner organizations, where it's located. It describes the activities and results of the program using qualitative and quantitative information. And then they just expanded some more on Schedule O. So it's very important when you're going through your 990 to make sure that you are describing what you actually did during the year. Don't just repeat your mission on these 3 questions. They are 3 different questions and the IRS wants to know different information for each of those, and really use these questions as an opportunity to market and brag on what your organization did during the year. Moving on to the next part of Form 990. This is a list of 38 questions, yes or no questions, that asks if your organization has had different transactions, different kind of activities during the year. Depending on what your organization does, you may or may not have to answer additional schedules. So if you answer yes to any of these questions, you're going to have to complete an additional schedule. So when you're looking at this section, I would really encourage you to look at last year's return to see which questions were answered yes. And if it's not answered yes this year, why? Is that correct, or should it be answered yes? So this section, I'm not really going to go into a whole lot, but just be aware that if your organization has certain activities, you may be required to complete additional schedules of the 990. Moving on to the next section, next part of the 990, statements regarding other IRS filings and tax compliance. Here again are 12 questions and information on tax compliance. So, did you file the W-2s, the 1099s, that type of thing. So here it's intended to alert the organization to other potential federal tax compliance matters and obligations. So again, I'm not really going to go into this section very much today, but just be aware that these questions need to be answered as well. And then moving down to the next part. So this is, I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this section. So governance, management, and disclosure. So this is what the IRS calls their crown jewel of Form 990. So back in 2008, when they redesigned Form 990, this section was new. Never before had the government ask such internal operations on internal questions, such detailed questions on internal operations. So some people weren't very happy about the questions that they were asking. However, the IRS really their view is that good governance and accountability practices provide safeguards that the organization's assets will be used consistently with its exempt purposes. And that's really critical to tax compliance. So the IRS says that if your organization has these policies and procedures in place, then you are more likely to be a good nonprofit and follow the requirements and file your 990 timely and be transparent and that type of thing. All organizations must answer all of these questions. Some of the questions here ask about certain policies and procedures in place. These policies and procedures are not required by the IRS. And you'll see in the next section, it specifically says that they are not required. However, they are more of best practices. And if you answer these questions no, the reader may have a less than ideal view of your organization. So again, it's not an IRS requirement to have these in place. It's more of a best practices. And you probably want to make sure that you have as many of these in place as possible. So the first section here talks about your board. So the number of voting members at the end of the year. So this could be different at the end of the year versus during the year. So as of December 31st or June 30th, or however your year end is, how many members of the board could actually vote? Also, how many of them were independent? The IRS is very big on making sure that you have an independent board. So these are people that are not paid by the organization. It also asks about family relationships. So we don't want to have a board that just has a family or a bunch of people that own a business together. The IRS feels that if you are more independent from each other, you're going to have a better board that asks more questions, has broader view of different situations. So making sure your organization is independent. Did the organization, line 4, did the organization make any significant changes to its governing documents? Again, so if you change your bylaws, if you change your articles, you can do that, that's fine. We just have to make sure that we notify the IRS of these changes. Here the IRS asks if there are any material diversion of assets. That is fraud. So if your organization had fraud and you're aware of it, the IRS wants to know. That's line 5 here. And it does have to be significant. So small amounts, if somebody took $20 from the petty cash, they don't care about that. But if you have significant fraud, the IRS wants to know, and you need to report that to the IRS. And then just, does line 8, does the organization have written board meetings? In the state of Indiana, it's required to have written minutes for board meetings. So you want to make sure that you have written minutes that document who was there, what was discussed, any significant decisions, making sure that those are maintained by the organization. So Section A really talks about the governing body and management, and then Section B talks about different policies that should be in place. And again, the IRS specifically says that these policies are not required by the Internal Revenue Code. However, they want to know if you have them in place. So if they want to know if you have them in place, you should probably have them in place. These policies must be written. If they're not written, you technically don't have them in place. And they should also be in place during the year. So if your organization does not have these policies in place, now may be a good time to look into putting some of these in writing. Has the organization provided a complete copy of this 990 to all members of its governing body? So that's what we started with today, that the IRS is asking, are you providing a copy of this 990 to your board members? You do not have to provide them a paper copy. You can email a copy of this form, make it available to everyone. That's fine. That's sufficient. Just make sure that it is a complete copy. It has to be an exact copy of what was filed with the IRS. So Schedule B, where we're going to list all of the donors' names and addresses and the dollar amounts they donated, that has to be provided. You have to, the names of the donors and the addresses, that has to be provided to the board members to enable to answer this question, yes. Now, if you don't do that, you can answer this question, no, that's fine. But again, it would probably be a good idea to be able to answer this question, yes. In addition, it also asks the process that's used to review this Form 990. So that might be just that you have the 990 prepared and it is emailed out to the board for review, and then it is voted on and approved at the next board meeting. Very simple, just make sure you have something in writing for that. The next question asks if your organization has a written conflict of interest policy. Hopefully all of your organizations do. I do know that currently when the IRS is accepting tax exempt applications, they will send it back if you don't have a conflict of interest policy. So maybe organizations that were created a very long time ago might not have one, but hopefully everyone does have a conflict of interest policy in place. And then also, our officers, key employees required to disclose annually these interests that could give rise to conflict. So are they required annually to sign off on a conflict of interest policy? And then also, how is that monitored by the organization? So we can't just say that we're requiring everyone to sign the policy. Yes, that's just saying you have a policy and then it's required to be completed annually. That's not really saying how we're monitoring or enforcing it. So how are we doing that? The next two items, the written whistleblower policy and the document retention and destruction policy, are two policies that, while they're not required by the IRS, they are required by Sarbanes-Oxley. So the whole Enron situation that happened about 20 years ago, 2001, they required certain policies to be implemented by for-profit businesses. However, there were some that were also applied to nonprofits. These two, a whistleblower policy and a document retention and destruction policy, were specifically required to be implemented by nonprofits as well. So if you don't have those in place, you might want to consider implementing those in place. And any of these policies, if your organization doesn't currently have them, we do have templates that we would be happy to provide to you. So just let us know and we can certainly provide those to you. Question 15 talks about compensation. So your organization's ED, CEO, how are you determining their compensation? The IRS is really big on making sure that nonprofit CEOs are being paid properly. Now in Fort Wayne, this probably isn't a huge deal where nonprofit CEOs and EDs are receiving excessive payments. However, it is something that is big on their IRS's radar. So we want to make sure that we have a process in place within our organization. And again, it should be a written process that says how our CEO or executive director is, how they're paid. So is it the executive? Is there an executive committee or the board that approves their salary each year? Is there a review process for this individual? Do you look at comparability data to determine other similar nonprofits of similar size, similar area, providing similar services to see how much their CEOs are being paid and then compare that to your organization? So we want to have some kind of process in place. And then making sure that we're documenting that each year to determine how we are paying our CEOs and executive directors. Next section of this, the governance section, is the disclosure. So as a nonprofit, there are certain documents that a nonprofit has to be made available to the public. So if anyone can come ask your organization for a copy of their Form 1023 or Form 1024. So that is your initial tax exempt application that was filed with the IRS. In addition, Form 990 and Form 990T are also required to be made available to the public. So if someone comes and asks you for any of those forms, we need to make sure that we have those available to provide those. The IRS also asks here if you make other things available, if you make a conflict of interest policy, if you make your financial statements available to the public, you can, that's perfectly fine. It's not required. But the IRS wants to know if you are doing that. Some organizations like to do that just because they feel that it provides more transparency. And some organizations automatically will put those on their website, and that's fine. But again, that is not a requirement to make your conflict of interest policy or financial statements available. They're just asking that if you do, how do you do that? you can put these items, your 1023, 990, on your own website. Sometimes they are provided on another's website. Now, another's website does not mean GuideStar. So if your 990 is available on GuideStar and that's the only other person's website, you cannot answer this question. GuideStar does not count as another's website because that's just all pulled from the IRS website. And then usually upon request is what most people check there. The next part of the 990 talks more about your organization's board members. Based on the answers here, you may also need to complete Schedule J. Schedule J goes into a little bit more detail on related to compensation and benefits, especially those that are paid at much higher salary rates. This section is important. It asks for you to list all of your board members during the year. So anyone that served on your board of directors at any time during the year needs to be listed here. Now, it's important to list these individuals properly. When you review your 990, make sure that the correct people are listed here, because these are the people that are ultimately responsible for your organization. So if something were to happen, these are the individuals that are going to be responsible. So also when you're completing this, make sure that your board listing matches the bylaws as far as the number of people and officer positions. So if you are only allowed to have 10 board members, but you had more than 10 at the end of the year, that's not in compliance with your bylaws. Or if your bylaws say you have a chair, a vice chair, a treasurer, and a secretary, but you don't have those 4 officers listed here, then again, you're going to be in violation of your bylaws. So when filling out this form, make sure that you check to make sure your bylaws are in line with how this question is being answered. So not only do we need to list the names of our board members, but we also need to list the average hours per week. So how many hours per week as a board member does that person provide to your nonprofit? And this can be an estimate. A lot of times it's 1 or 2 hours, which is fine. However, you're also going to need to list your executive director or CEO here as well, because they're considered an officer of the organization. And that person probably works more than 40 hours a week. So oftentimes I'll see the executive director listed with 40 hours, which is fine if that's what you want to report and that's what they work. However, if they work 60 hours, put down 60 hours. That's what their average hours are. The column C has 6 or 7 different positions that the individuals listed in this section may be listed as. And I see this section sometimes get confused. So we're going to take a little bit of time here to go over these. So an individual trustee or director, those again are anybody that has served as a board member at any time during the year. So it doesn't matter if they were paid or not, if they served as a board member, a voting board member, they need to be listed here and this box needs to be checked. An officer of the organization is the person that is in charge of your daily operations. So it's going to be your executive director or your CEO. In addition, it's also going to be your board officers. So your chair, vice chair, secretary, or treasurer. So officers are those people that are voted on as a board members, but then also hired for a specific duty to run the organization. Sometimes you may also see the CFO listed as an officer here, depending on what their responsibility is. If the CFO is ultimately responsible for the financials and as opposed to the executive director, they could be listed here. But if you have an accountant that more of just does the bookkeeping and reports to the CEO or executive director, they're probably not going to be listed as an officer. Key employees are employees that make over $150,000. So yes, they may be a key employee, very important to your organization, but if they don't make over $150,000, they should not be listed here. This box should not be checked. And then also highest compensated employees, those are employees that make over $100,000. So key employees and highest compensated employees are based on their salary. Board members, CEOs, executive directors, it doesn't matter how much they make, they all have to be listed here. And then former officers, board members are those individuals that were not a board member or a officer this year. They were in a prior year, but for some reason they're still getting paid this year. Maybe there was a pension or there was some kind of payout when they retired. So they would be listed here. Column D asks for the reportable compensation. Everybody wants to know how much your executive director is making or if the board members are paid. So the IRS asks from the W-2. So this would be from the W-2 of the tax period that this 990 covers. So if you're a December 31st, 2020 organization, then the W-2 would be from 2020. If your organization is a fiscal year and ends in June, so say your organization has a June 30, 2020 year end or 2021 year end, the W-2 that you would use would be for the 2020 calendar year. Same way with the 1099. So it would be for the calendar year that falls in the fiscal year. And then if there's any compensation from a related organization, so maybe there's a foundation or some other related organization that also pays those individuals, we need to list their salary here. And then also other compensation. So retirement, health insurance, that type of information needs to be listed. So it's really important when you're reviewing this section to first make sure that the names here listed here are correct. And then also that the amount of compensation here is listed properly too. So it's very important that you have W-2s to make sure that this section is completed properly. And again, depending on how you answer these questions, you may have to answer questions on Schedule J. So if you have former officers or directors that make over $100,000 or key employee over $100,000, directors over $10,000, or if you have an individual that receives compensation from an unrelated source for services rendered during the organization, or if the organization provided any type of first-class travel or charter, those additional benefits, you might have to look at Schedule J to see if you need to answer those. Moving on to the next section of the 990. So most of the stuff we covered so far is words. We really haven't reported a whole lot of financials. So page 9 really starts the financials. So here is where you're going to report your revenue sources, just like on your financial statement. So just, looking at, make sure that that looks reasonable. Your revenue and on your 990 may not agree entirely to what is on your financial statements because in-kind donated services and use of facilities are not recorded in this revenue section here, as well as unrealized gains and losses are not recorded in this section here. So there may be a reconciling item between those two. The next section is your expenses. So we talked about your revenue and then they want to know about your expenses. Again, allocated between 3 functions: program services, management, general, and fundraising. So when you're reviewing this section, just make sure that the allocation between these 3 functions looks reasonable. When the reader looks at the 990, they're going to want to see how much is spent on program versus management and general and fundraising. Next page is your balance sheet. Again, straight from your financial statements, you have last year's and then you have at the end of the year, your assets, liabilities, net assets. Reconciliation of net assets. So here's where unrealized gains and losses are reported in this section for the 990. And then the next part here, financial statements and reporting. Just want to talk a little bit about this section. The IRS wants to know if you have had an audit or a review done by an independent accountant. So if you have had a compilation, a review, or an audit done, you'll need to answer these questions yes. And then also, if you have a committee that assumes responsibility of the oversight of the audit, review, or comp, you want to answer that yes. So just making sure that if you did have an audit done, that that answer is answered correctly. That question is answered correctly. Then also they ask if you have a A133 single audit done. So if your organization spent more than $750,000 of federal funds during the year, you are probably required to have a single audit performed. So the IRS wants to know, hey, are you required to have that audit done, and did you have that audit done? So again, just making sure that these questions are answered appropriately. So that is the the Form 990, the basic core forms. We're just going to take a few minutes to go over three schedules that a lot of nonprofits have to file. So Schedule A is the public charity status and public support. So when an organization, when a nonprofit initially receives its tax exempt status from the IRS, it is going to be considered either a public charity or a private foundation. So there's different rules between the two. If you're a private foundation, you have to file the 990 PF as opposed to the 990. If you're a private foundation, you have to give out a certain percentage of your, distributions, you have to make a certain percentage of distributions each year. And as a private foundation, you have to pay excise taxes. Public charities do not have to do that. So if you're initially determined to be a public charity, the IRS wants to make sure that you are continuing to be a public charity each year, and they use this form to determine that. So the first page here under Part 1 asks basically, why are you a public charity? And that's from your IRS determination letter, your tax exempt application form. Why are you a public charity versus a private foundation? So the two most common reasons are line 7, where you would receive a substantial part of your support from either the government or the general public. So you're getting contributions and grants from foundations, individuals, corporations, government. Or on line 10, you get a lot of contributions, but you're also getting some kind of fee for service, whether it be membership fees or program service fees, some other type of fee for service. So number 7 and number 10 are the two most common reasons that nonprofits receive the public charity status. So after you have identified why you are a public charity, then there is an additional test that has to be done. And depending on which question or which line you mark, there are two different tests. Basically what this does is that the IRS looks at the current year and the previous 4 years to determine where you're getting your support from. And there's a calculation that's done. And when after the calculation is done, it comes down to line 14 and 15 to determine what percentage of your public support that you're getting. This amount here needs to be 33 1/3 or more. So it is very important when you review your 990 that you look at these numbers to see if these percentages are above 33 1/3%. If the organization percentage is 33 1/3 or more, it's deemed publicly supported for the current year and the immediately following tax year. However, if this percentage falls below 33 1/3%, that means that your organization is not publicly supported. So that means it's getting all of its revenue, not from a whole bunch of different sources, but from, single sources or of very few sources. If you fail this public support test for 2 consecutive years, the IRS is saying, okay, you're not a publicly supported organization anymore. That means you're going to be determined to be a private foundation. That means you have to file a 990 PF. That means you have to pay excise taxes and you have to follow all the rules for a private foundation. So it's very important when you're reviewing your 990 to make sure to look to see what your percentage is here. And also, even if it is above 33 1/3%, but if it is gradually decreasing, like maybe it used to be 80% and then it's decreasing to 60 and now it's down to 40, that should raise a red flag, and you should look, okay, we need to see where we're getting our funding from and what can we do to make sure that we don't fall below the 33 1/3%, because if you're a publicly supported organization, you don't want to flip over and become a private foundation. So Schedule A, just make sure that these percentages are above 33 1/3%. And then I wanted to touch briefly on Schedule B as I skim through these pages here, kind of going fast through these. Okay, Schedule B, this form also needs to be completed by most nonprofit organizations. This lists who your contributors are during the year. And it depends, there's a calculation as to who's listed here. Normally it's $5,000 and above, or 2% of your total revenue. So just make sure that if you do have contributors, ask whether this needs to be completed. In this middle section here, we need to list the name and address of the contributors and then how much those each gave during the year. The IRS does not like to see the word anonymous. The IRS has decided that if you as a nonprofit organization received gifts from someone, there should be a way for you to figure out who that donor is. So again, try to not use anonymous as much as possible. This page, this Schedule B here, this name and address of your contributors, that is the only section of the Form 990 that is not available for public inspection. So if someone comes and asks you for a copy of your 990, make sure that you do not give them these names and addresses here. Normally, when we provide a copy of the Form 990 and Schedule B, we will have a public disclosure copy, which these names and addresses will be redacted here. They won't show up. It'll just show the dollar amount. So just also, I've seen a lot of nonprofits when they put their 990 on their website, make sure you're putting the proper copy, the public disclosure copy on your website. And then finally, real quick, just the very last schedule that I wanted to touch on is Schedule O. And this is Schedule O. It is just a blank sheet. So any questions that go over, do not fit in the lines provided on the 990 can be put here. Any additional information that you want to provide to the IRS can be included here. So again, the IRS is really, it allows exempt organizations to provide any additional information, whether it's required or not. Any additional information that you want the IRS and the reader of this 990 to know, you should be putting on this schedule. Many organizations expect this form to be where the place that the organizations tell their story. So it's very common for most organizations to have Schedule O completed, again, to expand on those questions that were on the 990, that they just need some additional information. So again, those are just the three main schedules that a lot of nonprofits will have to complete: Schedule A, Schedule B, and Schedule O. But you're just going to want to make sure that if your organization does have any other types of unique activities or enters into new transactions during their year, that any of those additional schedules may need to be completed. So that's a quick overview of the 990 and those three schedules. So I think I'm going to turn it back over to Amanda before we wrap up.
Yeah, thank you so much, Carrie. I just wanted to let everyone know that if you go to the nonprofit education section on our website, we have actually gone ahead and scheduled monthly webinars through the first quarter of 2022. So check it out, and hopefully there will be different topics that you find interesting and you will sign up for them. And also, when you log out of the Zoom window, you will notice that a link for a survey pops up. If you would please take a moment, it should only take about a minute or so. We would appreciate any feedback you could provide. If there are no questions, I wanted to thank everyone for attending and have a great day.